Welcome to the Empty World podcast. The empty world refers to economist Herman Daly's concept. We've moved from a world where natural resources seemed infinite to one where we're bumping up against planetary boundaries. Yet our economic models still assume we can grow infinitely on a finite planet. This podcast normalizes conversations about degrowth, not as economic collapse, but as conscious choices about what really matters for human flourishing. I'm your host, Gabriel Bonomi. I'm a master's student at MIT, and my hope is to bring together researchers, practitioners, and policymakers who are reimagining economic systems for the 21st century. Today, we're exploring degrowth with Matt Orsagh, and I think you'll find his story to be both intriguing and hopeful. As co-founder of the Arketa Institute and former senior director of capital markets policy at the CFA Institute, Matt has worked in finance as a researcher, writer, speaker, and convener of sustainability-focused professionals. But unlike many in his field who've embraced sustainable finance or green growth, Matt has become an active advocate for something different: degrowth, ecological economics, and the well-being economy. Matt's recent work, including Arketa's By Disaster or Design report, challenges us to reimagine not just how we might green our existing economy, but how we might fundamentally reimagine what prosperity means in the 21st century. Matt, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Perhaps to get us started, I'm curious about your personal evolution. Working in finance for over 2 decades, what was your limits to growth moment? Take us through your understanding of evidence that made you think this system isn't working the way we pretend it does.
Yeah, for me, I think it was more a process than a moment. And I think it's probably edifying to people to hear kind of how I got there, a broader story. I'll try not to be too long. But I started out, in university. I liked writing. I liked movies. I liked storytelling. So I concentrated, my degrees were in communications and film, very far away from finance. I knew how to balance a checkbook, and I got my first credit card in college and all those things. But that was kind of the extent of my finance expertise back then. After a couple of years, I graduated in the mid-90s. After a couple of years of working in the world, I realized I should probably make myself more marketable. And I went and started to get and eventually got a finance degree, a graduate degree in finance. That led me to, one of my professors was a CFA charter holder. And the CFA, for those who don't know, it's kind of one level beyond kind of an MBA in finance. It's for the hardcore finance nerds. It's kind of a designation for financial professionals where you take three exams over 3 years, or that's shortened now. Very rigorous exams. Unfortunately for me, I passed the first one, and then I told myself I had to keep going, and I passed both of them, and I got my CFA charter. I was a minted charter holder in 2003, and then I actually joined the CFA Institute itself when they started their think tank arm in 2005. And I think that was the perfect gig for me because I had a background in research and writing, and I like stories and communicating things in stories. I knew how to do all the spreadsheets now and what a balance sheet and income statement was. But for me, what was more interesting was, what is the story of this company or this industry or this economy? How do you tell that in prose instead of numbers, or both? I could do both. And I think that was something that I gravitated to. So I was at CFA Institute then 17 years, and most of what I was doing was research, writing, speaking, communicating around sustainability issues. I started out in governance. That led to ESG and sustainability. I was one of my first assignment at CFA was to be part of the meetings that led to the creation of the UNPRI, Principles of Responsible Investment, that really coined the term ESG, and ESG and sustainability took off from there. So I was kind of present at creation in that. My career followed that sustainability and ESG path. So I saw ESG start and sustainability start, and just like anybody else, I was in that world. And I really didn't come across the concepts of ecological economics and degrowth, which we'll get into more in detail later, until about, 6 or 7 years ago. And it wasn't a bolt from the blue. I read, Limits to Growth or Less is More or any of those books. I did read those, but later I came across these concepts in my research, and I thought, well, that's odd. Degrowth, that sounds terrible. That sounds like, let's have a Great Depression on purpose to make things right. I was like, well, that sounds horrible. I don't want to do that. But, I want to know the stories behind things. And I dug deeper. into ecological economics, into degrowth, into well-being economy, into what a post-growth world would look like, and all those things. And over time, as I said, it was more of a process. I came to the conclusion, just through research and critical thinking and math and stories, that the path we are on as an economy, neoclassical economics and capitalism as we practice them today, is leading us down, maybe over a cliff, I think, is probably the best metaphor I can use. Because there are, of course, limits to growth. Our economics don't adequately take into account the energy we need to produce what we want, and producing what we want creates much more waste than we can deal with, and the planet can deal with. And part of that is carbon dioxide, and part of that is other greenhouse gases, but part of that is also plastics, and that gets into deforestation and overuse of water and overuse of pesticides and chemicals and all those things, which I'm not, and never considered myself an environmentalist. I think of an environmentalist, someone who thinks of the spotted owl before they think of themselves. And that's noble in its own way, but that's not me. I want to know, is this world going to be here for my children? And it's not, is the conclusion I came to, or not in the way I want it to be. And it's going to be very compromised. And our ecology is going to start breaking down, as the limits to growth told us, as the research of Guy Harrington, who revisited that, I think 5 or 6 years ago, she wrote kind of an update on that, limits to growth, and came to the same conclusions. It's just physics and chemistry. Mother Nature can't be negotiated with. What is going to happen is going to happen based on how well we live within our limits. And of course, now we are not. And that gets to, the paper we wrote by Disaster Design. A post-growth world is coming, whether we wish it was or wasn't. And it's just, do we design that as best we can? There'll still be problems. Or do we just keep on going and wait for the disaster, the collapse to come? So I'll stop there. That's kind of how I set things. Again, to me, it was a process. Other people, have light bulbs over their head moments. But for me, it was more slowly realizing what was happening. And we can talk more about what comes after that going forward.
Let's dive into the problem. In the past, I think you've talked about how neoclassical economics ignores thermodynamics. It ignores planetary boundaries. Can you help our listeners understand why this is and why it matters? What happens when our economic model doesn't respect the laws of physics?
Well, evidently, some pretty bad stuff, but we'll get into that as we talk. I'll probably do the worst thing you could do on a podcast is to talk about a diagram that really describes this. But I think most people have seen this or can picture it. It's a classic economics diagram of you have firms on one side and households on another. And there's a arrow going from firms to households and an arrow going back from households to firms. It's a virtuous circle, right? The firms provide wages to households and goods and services for households. Households provide labor that produces those goods and services. And when the money they get, they spend that money on goods and services. Fantastic. And that's that virtuous circle of our economy. It's a bit of an oversimplification, but that's kind of how we imagine the neoclassical economics we live with today. And neoclassical economics, it's not a bogeyman. It's not something evil. It just is the system we have. It's evolved to serve our purposes today. I think it has some failings, as every system does. But instead of dealing with those failings and addressing them, we've just kind of papered over them or ignored them. And people have lobbied to ignore them because it keeps, the party going. It keeps us growing. And that gives us more wealth in our pockets and our living standards rise and we have more stuff, but at the cost of our environment ultimately. Neoclassical economics has really come about over the past 50 years or so. It's become kind of the dominant model. And there's a lot of events that lead up to that. First of all, we're going to be talking for about an hour or so, but I encourage people to go and find this information for themselves. I've been on this journey in this world for the past 6 or 7 years, and I'm always learning new things. If this is your only entry into ecological economics and degrowth, you need to do more. I'm going to give you more homework. But for me, and a lot of people who talk about this, one of the seminal moments was in the mid-30s, an economist in the U.S., Simon Kuznets, was tasked with a better way to measure how we measure our success as an economy. Now, what he came up with is GDP, something now we just kind of assume has been around forever, handed down on high is the way you measure progress in an economy. I remember sitting on the floor of our living room with my dad and mom watching the nightly news when I was, 8 or 9, understanding when the GDP report would come out and it would be on the Friday news. Oh, growing GDP good, falling GDP bad. We need to grow. We want to grow. Growth is how you get more stuff. Growth is how you get more wealth. Of course, we need to grow. But the problem is that there, of course, as the book says, limits to that growth. We live on a finite planet with a finite amount of resources. And not only that, we don't have places to put the waste that we produce. Or we do, but we don't manage it well. CO2 is one of those. And I've gone through, other things. And ecological economics, which is something more and more people are getting into today. But I didn't, like I said, I didn't come across it until like 6 or 7 years ago. And you can understand it's not really in finance's best interest to promote ecological economics because it kind of takes away the punch bowl at the party. It says you got to slow down. Growth isn't the most important thing. The ecology is the most important thing. And so if you look at that terrible diagram I just described, 5 minutes ago, I'm going to make it worse. And ecological economics adds arrows that you would have to see of the waste produced and where does the energy come from, And so the laws of thermodynamics say we only have so much energy in the world. We're not in the universe. We're not creating anymore. What comes from the sun is either stored in fossil fuels or wood that we burn, or within us, we're just carbon-based life forms after all. And we can't use it as efficiently as we would like to. The second law of thermodynamics says, there's no free lunch. Every system goes towards entropy, which is disorder in a system. The great example is a hot cup of coffee on a table slowly dissipates that heat around the room. And if you want to make it hot again, you have to do more work or add more energy to it. And so you have to have more energy to put into that cup of coffee if you want to keep it at that temperature. And so the way I phrase it is to kind of focus people's minds on it is the laws of thermodynamics were around 65 million years ago when the dinosaurs were wiped out. And that paved the way for mammals and eventually us to take over. But the laws of economics were not around. There was no neoclassical economics, or the non-communists might try to argue with me about that one. But there were no markets. There was none of that stuff. We invented that to fit our society, our culture, our politics, all those things. And we've lost track of, thermodynamics is really in charge. It's just physics and chemistry and the planetary boundaries, which is something I'll define, that really should be guiding what we're doing. Now, the planetary boundaries are 9 boundaries that are really, if you look at a life support system, our life support system on Earth, they talk about the 9 different systems that kind of make up the biosphere. Just one of them is climate. One of them is land use, water use, novel entities, which is plastics mostly, biochemical flows, which is phosphorus and nitrogen, ocean acidification, and a couple others. And we've breached, if you will, gone into kind of the danger zone or the red on 7 of those 9 planetary boundaries. And I think 10, 15 years ago, it was only 1 or 2 that we had crossed. I'd have to go back and look exactly. But what that shows us is those systems are breaking down. And those systems are our life support system. And climate is one, but it's not the only one. But they're all interrelated, like deforestation, land use, but that's mostly deforestation, makes climate change worse because there's less plants and less algae to absorb the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Ocean acidification is related to climate change because the oceans absorb most of the carbon dioxide because it's, 3/4 of the Earth is water, is oceans mostly. But that heats up the oceans. That makes the oceans more acidic. Think back to your chemistry class in high school. Any liquid system, such as us or the oceans, has a pH, and the pH needs to be balanced. Well, as the ocean absorbs more CO2, it becomes more acidic. It becomes harder for things with shells to live in the ocean. And as it becomes more acidic and those things can't live and those things die off, the things that eat them die off, and so on and so on. And we're getting close to a tipping point in the coming decades where you could start to see mass die-offs of mammals and then fish in the oceans, to the point where by the end of the century, you may just have jellyfish in the oceans, or most of life in the oceans would die off. And of course, that has cascading effects for us and all kinds of things. So the choice that we see before us is to slow down, to degrow and slow down, step off of that growth for growth's sake treadmill. And yes, there are challenges to that, and we'll talk about that. But it's just a matter of survival. It's not a matter of a political ideology or an economic ideology. And I know people try to frame it that way, and that's fine. But it's really about survival. And the sooner we realize that, and the sooner we try to manage this transition better, the better off we'll be. There'll still be problems, and there'll still be collapses of certain systems. But if we just ignore them, we really do so at our own peril.
Mm-hmm. This is really helpful. I think this is probably an appropriate point for us to suggest our listeners take a look at the work done by Herman Daly about the shift from an empty world to a full world, and how it connects with what you just said. Perhaps recentering our discussion on your experience, finance now represents a huge portion of the global economy. What is finance's place in a post-growth world? How should it evolve? Does it have a place?
Mm-hmm. I think it does. I learned all those years ago in my MBA classes that the job of finance is the efficient allocation of capital. And I think that's true, and that still will be true. But in a post-growth world that I think we need to move to, that efficient allocation of capital, the question you asked is allocating for what? For what purpose? And now it is for economic growth, is for that capital to grow. You know, the famous Milton Friedman essay from the 70s, where he said that the purpose of corporations was, returns for shareholders, nothing else. You shouldn't consider socially responsible investing because the social purpose of a company, according to Milton Friedman, was to make money for investors, full stop. Well, I think going forward, the efficient allocation of capital should have a caveat of the purpose of finance is the efficient allocation of capital, which keeps humanity within planetary boundaries, which, I argue and joke that anybody taking a course in finance needs to first take a course in physics and thermodynamics, because that tells you what is physically possible. And that puts a speed limit on you. That puts guardrails around you. And yes, that's less fun, but you're not going to have creating financial products that are destined to grow an economy to the detriment of the environment within which that economy sits. There's a great stat that I saw recently that shouldn't have surprised me, but it did surprise me, that in the Western world and developed economies, people spend 92% of their time indoors. Think about that. We don't really think I think that's strange, but most people probably don't think that's strange. Like, oh yeah, that makes sense. We sleep indoors. Of course, that's 1/3 of things. But that's part of us losing really our connection with the earth and Mother Nature. And again, I'm not an environmentalist. This isn't some hippie diatribe I'm going on, but just that our economies are nested within a society, which is nested within nature, the natural world, the biosphere, whatever you want to call it. We're not living somewhere off on some asteroid and we go to Earth to get resources. We're in it. We are of it. It is of us. And to deny that and just pretend it isn't the case is how we get disconnected from, the purpose of finance being don't screw things up first. And then once you don't screw things up, go make some money. Leave the place better than you found it kind of ethic that just doesn't fit within a system that is about, short-term returns to make sure that, and in noble ways, to make sure people have pensions and their kids save for education. I'm not railing at billionaires here. That's a separate conversation. But the system encourages us all to be dragons sitting on bigger piles of gold. To what end? Because that destroys the world that we need to live in. So let's change that. Let's change the purpose of finance to be within planetary boundaries. And that's going to be a big change for finance. But I just don't see any way around it. Our paper that came out, you and I are speaking in September, and in April, Arketa put out a paper by disaster design. And that's a phrase that, you see in the ecological economics literature. Peter Victor from York University is the first one I heard use it. He said by design or disaster. So I think I can use it without giving him any money, because I just switched the words. But that's where, that's the choice. And that's really not a choice. That's kind of in my journey. I saw that that's where we are. I can't consciously choose disaster just because it's more comfortable or it'll give me a bigger bank account, because that's the world I'm leaving my children and future generations will just be so compromised if we don't try to design things better. And that's in the paper we talk about, what does that mean for finance? The middle of our paper is, what does that mean for finance? Finance will have to focus probably more locally. It will probably shrink. You don't need all these derivatives and fancy ways to shuffle around paper just to create returns. And finance will have to focus on more local things. And we'd say more about in the paper, and there's many other people who have written about this as well. But focusing on regeneration of our natural world, of setting aside more of our natural world. There's a whole movement to save nature by pricing nature that I think is misguided, because it's the same kind of thing that we've seen with things like carbon markets, where there is a purpose and a place for voluntary carbon markets like carbon credits. But that's not going to do the job that needs to be done. A lot of it is getting out of the way, slowing down. And nature has this system, has this down, how to regenerate things and how to get us to where we need to be. That will take time, and we can help that along the way. But finance has a problem of not valuing something if it can't price it. And so a lot of what we need to realize is that that just has things backwards. An example I give is, if you have children, shouldn't you really be making sure they're returning your investment from the minute they're born? You've got to put them to work in some way from the minute they're born, to find some derivative to sell off of their from the minute they're born. No, that's ridiculous. How do you do that? You can't do that. But that's how we treat the natural world. It's got to have a return on us or for us. Our children are huge. I have children, so I know. And people listening to this have children know, they are expensive and they are costly. And there's no return on that investment, monetary wise. Well, maybe in some cases, but very rarely. And that's not what you expect, right? And that's not the point of having children and having a family. But that is what we picture nature for, or picture our natural world for. It has to give us some return, which that mindset needs to change. And the end of our paper, the third part of our paper, is about that. Is we understand this is a huge cultural change and a challenge to people's identities, because I'm a capitalist. Most people are, because we grew up in this capitalist system, and we identify by what we can do, our jobs, what we can earn, what wealth we have, and less about the community around us, which gets back to the 92% of the time spent indoors. That's very, thinking back through human history, that's very strange. That's the case, that we become disconnected from the thing that keeps us alive, the biosphere that keeps us alive. So we don't value it, and we're degrading it. And we need to reverse that process. And this doesn't mean everyone becomes Amish or we go back to living in caves, but we need to seriously have frank discussions with ourselves and with our leaders about where this is taking us. It's taking us off that cliff. And how do we not do that? And the first thing you need to do is stop the car and then figure out what's the best way forward.
Kind of related to that, one common response to degrowth is, nobody wants a recession on purpose. You said this in your introduction.
Right.
How do you respond to critics who equate degrowth with economic hardship? And what do you do when you stop the car and you have to sell a future that people can get behind?
Yeah, that's not easy. But at first you have to accept that you need to stop the car, because I think that's people come back with that. And that's why, I was just working on it this afternoon. Our next paper is on pension funds and pensions in a post-growth world, because that's the first question we get. It's like, well, I have a mortgage, I have a pension, I'm saving for my kids' education. That's based on growth. Why are you telling me I can't have that anymore? No, I don't want this. And then I just come back and say, well, you're going off a cliff. And they just kind of deny. It's the 7 stages of grief. The first is denial. Is the first denial? I think the first is denial. It's like, well, no, I don't like what you're saying. I'm going to deny that the problem exists. And that's kind of where a lot of us are. A lot of people are. And I was there in the very beginning. It's like, what? Is this really a problem? And then I'm at acceptance. I know acceptance is the last stage. And you accept the world as it is and work to get around the problem. And how degrowth does that is, we've always had, as long as humans have been trading, we've always had markets, and we've always had ways to make things and sell things and buy things, get things we needed. But as I said, it's only in the last 50 years that we've kind of had this neoclassical economics turbocharged growth as this is the norm. This is what we need to be doing. So question that. I would say we don't, but question that for yourself. Do your research, find out what's behind that. And what degrowth is, again, I have a chart in my head that I'm going to describe that is horrible radio, horrible podcasting. But you have growth right now that's going above planetary boundaries. Planetary boundaries are kind of the guardrail we need to be in, but the level we need to be under. But our line is well above that now. Degrowth needs to get us back within, go down to get us back within those planetary boundaries. And then within those planetary boundaries, underneath that line is a well-being economy focused on well-being and not on growth. That's a post-growth economy that someone will name something clever down the road. I don't know what that's called. Maybe it's still called capitalism with some other flavor. I don't know. And what degrowth doesn't say that growth is bad, that all growth is bad. We need to go back and stop growing. We need to just grow our own food and make all our own clothes and go back to, it's just a very simple way of life that makes everybody miserable. No. What degrowth says is it's a equitable descaling of economic growth. So where we're focusing, we grow things we need to grow, and we stop growing things that are harming us. So of course, like private jets and cruises and, SUVs would be de-emphasized and phased out to some degree in a degrowth, moving towards a post-growth world. Degrowth is a path towards a post-growth world. It's not an end in and of itself. And of course, that changes policies because you have to have things that go along with that. One policy you'll see if people start researching this is universal basic income. People have probably already seen this if they're into AI, because AI is going to replace all of us, and what are we going to do if AI replaces all our jobs? But universal basic income has come around, or it's been around for decades. And what it is exactly what those words say. There's a universal basic income that creates a floor under which it's kind of at the poverty rate, so no one falls below the poverty rate. We had a very practical example of this during COVID here in the United States and other places, where people got a check in the mail to keep people below a certain threshold. And that makes sure the economy keeps on going and that no one, falls below that level. Now, the argument is, well, wait, doesn't that just spike inflation and spike deficits and all that stuff? Yes, well, then you have to have monetary policy that handles that. And I'm going to get in trouble here because modern monetary theory is not my expertise. I've read books on it. I've read about it. But the basic gist is that creating money in deficits is not the problem. It's the problem if it causes inflation. And you can manage inflation through taxing in a lot of different ways. And all the talk of deficits, and we have these huge deficits, ignores the fact that the government will never, ever run out of money. They make the money. They press a button on a computer, boom, more money. Now, yes, that's dangerous. That's dangerous because it could lead to inflation. But anytime a politician says, we can't pay for that, what they're saying is, we don't want to pay for that. Not we can't pay for that. It's not the same as you and I, because we don't create our own currency. We use the U.S. currency or the euro or the yen or whatever currency you use. Nations that create their own currency, it's like magic. They create their own currency. Now they have to manage it, but there's never the argument that we can't pay for that is we choose not to pay for that. And so degrowth talks about there would be an increase in a lot of social programs. Another one is jobs guarantee. So the government would be the unemployment rate would go away. Basically, the unemployment rate is kind of an unnatural thing. We're choosing, and economists in neoclassical economics again have chosen that this level of employment, whatever it is, 4%, 2.5%, is what we have to have, or we're going to have inflation. So 2 to 4% or whatever it is of our nation needs to be unemployed. They have to take the pain so everybody else can have a good time, a good life, which is a bit cruel if you stop and think about it. So a jobs guarantee says that there are jobs that the government will be the employer last resort. And that kind of sets a floor on what the minimum wage would be. And anybody who wants a job would have a job. Now, this isn't some Soviet system where it's just, you go to a factory and twiddle your thumbs for 2 hours or for 8 hours and get paid. The way it should work is that I live in Central Virginia. The state of Virginia, or my city or my county, is in charge of what needs to be done, whether it's, and with baby boomers retiring, there's a lot of, the care economy would grow. The regenerative economy would grow. The rewilding economy would grow. Education would grow. Another policy is a 4-day work week. John Maynard Keynes, the economist, famously said about 80 years ago that we'd all be working 15 hours a week by now, or by the turn of the last century. I don't know about you, but I think most people are still working much more than that. But his idea was productivity will go up so much we won't need to, and we don't. Now, a lot of a lot of places are flirting with like 4-day work weeks. So your wages would stay the same or roughly the same. You'd work 4 days. That's more employment. It depends on the industry, of course. Someone working at the service industry is different than someone working at someone working at McDonald's or at a clothing store is different than someone working at Wall Street or a lawyer or a doctor. So those details need to be ironed out. But a 4-day work week gives people more time. We're not all on those treadmills chasing growth. That the point isn't to chase growth. The point is what's the well-being of the society. And we throw away GDP as a measure of growth or a measure of well-being because it's not. People may still measure it, but what we should be measuring on what's the happiness of our society, what's the education level of our society, what's the lifespan of our society, and how much of that lifespan is spent in health. We in the United States are some of the longest living people in the world, but we spend more time unhealthy at the end of our lives than most developed nations. But we don't really measure that. That's a more important measure than GDP for me. And there's many other things. You'd have more public transportation, more focus on a care economy, there's laws against planned obsolescence in some markets. And planned obsolescence, the best example is your phone, your smartphone. That is, planned to be obsolete in a year or two, so you have to buy a new one. Well, what if that lasted 5 years? I'm holding up, again, horrible radio. I'm holding up a phone that I've had for 5 years. I don't need a new one. It works fine. It doesn't have the fanciest camera. It doesn't have the best software. It's a little slow and the battery has to charge once a day, but it's fine. What if all of our appliances lasted twice as long? And they very well could. But our system that tells us we need more growth means we need to buy a phone every year or two. We need to buy a refrigerator every 5 years instead of 10 years. I don't know how long refrigerators last. They should. And so those things I rattled off are just, a couple of the policies that come along with the post-growth world. But, this is just people have been working on this, for the past couple of decades, trying to figure out, well, what would that look like? And so, we've had universal basic income and job guarantees and a 4-day work week here and there tested in different places. And most post-growth policies are very popular with people because they get you to a more well-being economy. It's not about being that dragon sitting on a bigger pile of gold in your cave by yourself. It's about building a better community and a healthier life. But that is anathema to our economic system that challenges the capitalist need to keep growing for more. Again, I don't think capitalism is evil. Some people do. It's the name we put on the system we have. And if these ecological problems were 500 years, projected to be 500 years down the road, I wouldn't be worrying about them. I'd be saying, let's make these little changes, and over time, those little changes will expand, and it'll be solved. But the problem is here already, and so we don't have that luxury. And so we can't just pretend that we don't need to worry about these things. And I'll answer the question I think comes next in this argument that we did in the paper is, well, isn't green growth the answer? And isn't clean energy the answer? More nuclear, more wind, more solar, more geothermal. And the answer is no. We've seen throughout the years that anytime a new, more efficient system comes online, a more efficient way to use fuel, we use more of it. It's called Jevons paradox. I suggest people look it up. And Jevons was an economist back, I think it was 200 or so years ago. And in his day, it was about the use of coal. And more efficient machines meant you could use coal more efficiently. So what happened? They used more coal, and the pollution got worse, and the energy use got more. And so, yes, wind is better than fossil fuels. Yes, solar is better than fossil fuels. But those use materials, and the construction of those materials, guess how they do that? Our energy mix is still about 75-80% fossil fuels, and it's going down like maybe 1% a year, something like that. That's not going to get us where we need to be. Now, if nuclear fusion comes around tomorrow and is perfected tomorrow, it'll still take decades to get it to your front door. So we need to be using less. We need to be consuming less because green growth is not the answer. A lot of people in the sustainability world promise it and wish it was, and they'll tell you it is, but the thermodynamics just doesn't add up. There's a great phrase about thermodynamics. I'm trying to remember it now. It's the first law of thermodynamics says the game is rigged, meaning there's only so much energy. And the second one is, oh God, now I'm blanking on it. The game is rigged. Here it is. The first one is the game is rigged. The second one is you can't even break even. That's the second law of thermodynamics. Entropy. There's no perfectly efficient machine. And the third law is you can't leave the game. And that's where we are. And those are the limits that are given to us. And we pretend they don't exist all we want. But the game is rigged, energy-wise, materials-wise. You can't even break even. There's nothing that's going to be clean energy isn't going to get you there. And you can't leave the game. This is the only, you can't play by any other rules than thermodynamics. We need to accept that and work within those dynamics and then figure out how do we go forward.
So kind of reimagining prosperity seems to be the major challenge if we accept that there is no alternative to degrowth. It is by disaster or design. When you strip away the growth imperative from the way that we define prosperity, and that is quite challenging, could you help us understand what's left? What does prosperity actually mean in a post-growth world? What should it mean? How do we shift from measuring success by GDP to measuring it by well-being? Is it our relationships? Is it the way that we connect to the natural world? Where do we find meaning?
You want me to answer that question? Where do we find meaning? I think that's been the whole human project this whole time. I certainly don't have the answer. No, I do have the answer in a broad sense, I think. And that I think it's community. It's, we all want to belong to something bigger than ourselves. And there's survey or study after study, and you can go look up these studies. They're very easy to find, showing that over a certain level of wealth, happiness doesn't increase. And, our contentment with life and our feelings of well-being don't increase any. So those dragons sitting on a pile of gold, billionaires around the world, I don't need to name them, you know who they are. They're not any happier than you or I. They just are compelled to play this game to get bigger piles of gold. And our system encourages that. But for what purpose? We're all forced in this game that is destroying us. For what purpose? It's not making anyone happier. It's not making our lives better. It's just certain dragons get to sit on really, really big piles of gold. And that's a bit insane if you sit and think about it. I think that, and so what I always come back to is that, what do people seek in life and throughout human history, and what do people value? And it's community, it's family, it's connections. There's a great story about Abraham Maslow and Maslow's hierarchy of needs. When I was in 5th grade, we had a substitute teacher, and we thought, yay, we can kind of goof around today. But she taught us the difference between wants and needs. So think of your average 11-year-old, 10 or 11-year-old. That's a good lesson to teach them, the difference between wants and needs. And she taught us Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So I was this 11-year-old. I thought I was so enlightened. It's like, I know the purpose of life, It's self-actualization was the top of that pyramid, if you don't remember. The bottom was, food, shelter, and water. And you need to, have those things before you can move to kind of the next step of the pyramid. And you eventually, and it's love and belonging and having a purpose and all these other things. And at the top, Maslow thought of it as, he didn't put the pyramid together, but he kind of had a list. And he this is 150 years ago. And look up the story of Abraham Maslow. It's an interesting one. And the top of the pyramid was self-actualization. Well, that's very individualized. That's very live your best life, and you need to kind of achieve something and be something. And I was walking around with that in my head, since I was 11. It didn't make me a psychopath, I don't think, but it was just, it's kind of what I learned. It's like, oh, that makes sense, right? But I found out later, probably around the same time, I think, when I was learning about ecological economics and degrowth, that Maslow went to visit the Blackfoot tribe in Alberta, I believe it was, in Canada. And he thought, he just didn't understand them, because they had a culture of the collective was the most important thing. The community was the most important thing. And they thought he was insane because you were born self-actualized. What is this crap about you need to achieve something? You need to do this to have a life that's worth living. You were born that way. And don't do anything to mess up the society, to mess up the community. And what was most important was the health and survival of the community. And that's a very non-Western thing. I'm an American. I grew up in America. I know the hero's journey in the midst of individualism in the U.S. I like that stuff, but I know it has its limitations, and I know it has its negatives, just as putting community first in everything has its limitations and isn't always the best thing ever either. But I think there's a balance there. And Abraham Maslow left the Blackfoot not really understanding them, thinking they were little curious. And they left and thought he was crazy as well. But what I read is that later in his life, he kind of got it. And he actually did put belonging to something bigger than yourself at the top of as the most important thing in life. But he died before he could publish that. And so I learned, and all these people learned, that it was self-actualization, which isn't a bad goal, but it's a very focused goal on the self, and the self as the most important thing. And I think that if Abraham Maslow had never existed, we'd still be where we are. I'm not saying that he's led us to down this road. But that is our culture, is that the self and the individual is the most important thing. And we're supposed to be dragons sitting on bigger and bigger piles of gold. That keeps things going. But it's going to keep things going off a cliff. And that idea that you're already self-actualized, you don't need to achieve anything. You don't need to have that bigger pile of gold. And the community is the most important thing, is of course where we need to get to. Now, I don't know how exactly. I know, and we're trying to do our part at Arketa, and others are doing the same. But refocusing our way of life on putting community first within planetary boundaries. Prosperity is living well within planetary boundaries in a healthy community. That's what prosperity needs to become, and not for some hippie ideal, but because that's survival, and the alternative is not.
This is the perfect segue to my next question. You communicate about degrowth, you educate about degrowth. What language works and what doesn't when you're bringing up these notions, these topics that people may not have thought about a lot and that may come in direct conflict with their pre-existing assumptions about how the world works, about succeeding, about personal growth?
Yeah, I think it's very tricky. You have to meet people where they are, I believe. And realize that on that path from denial to acceptance, on the 7 stages of grief, which I think is a good analog to any large challenge to someone's worldview. I use it because it works that way, but it was created for something else. But I use it because that kind of fits. You have to understand, where are they on that path, on that continuum? Where are they in their career? Where are they in their spiritual beliefs? Where are they in their family dynamic? Where are they in their social dynamic? Are they an 18-year-old kid who the whole world's is in front of them? Or are they some 70-year-old patriarch of a billion-dollar corporation? Those are two very different people. If they want to talk to me, I'll probably talk to them using different language, trying to mostly listen to see where they're coming from. And the language of degrowth is a little difficult, but I also like it because, of course, it's meant to be a confrontational word. But that makes it incorruptible in a way. Like, I came up through the same sustainability world, and the world sustainability has been very corrupted and co-opted, through greenwashing, whether it's, products or financial funds or whatever it may be. People will pay a premium for something that's called sustainable because they want to be doing good, and it could be, a scam, or it could be not real or not very sustainable. But I don't see someone selling degrowth mutual funds anytime soon. It really kind of confronts you with what it's really about. If someone wants to talk about post-growth or ag-growth, which is agnostic to growth, or what a well-being economy is, or what donut economics is, and that could be another. You should have Kate Raworth on, or someone who talks about donut economics. Like, those are all things that kind of work together. They're not synonyms, but they're part of the same discussion. And so I want to make sure people in the degrowth world aren't too precious with their language. We try to write and communicate and talk in ways that engage people in conversations. If you're preaching at someone, you've lost them. And so degrowth is the word that is out there that people have used, that I'm using, but you need to meet people where they are. And about a third of the people we talk to don't want to talk to us, think we're communists or hate capitalism, or don't want to listen to us. About a third kind of get it, whether or not they use that language or not, of degrowth and ecological economics. And about a third don't really know, but are open to the conversation. And so our mission is to normalize the conversation around ecological economics and degrowth in the financial world, because, as you said, the financial world kind of drives things. It's the biggest part of the global economy. And I was in my late 40s when I first came to these things. And I think that's quite unfortunate. And we want to make sure that doesn't happen with the next generation and people out there in the financial world, sustainability world, or just in the world. But we see the ideas of degrowth, ecological economics, getting more in the everyday vernacular, and we see it pop up in more places because the challenges we're facing, it was inevitable that these kind of things are going to be talked about more.
By disaster or design.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Matt, I'm aware that we're coming to the end of our conversation, but before we go, I'd like to ask you whether you could share a recommendation of one or two books that have shaped your thinking on these topics and that you think our audience might enjoy reading after having listened to this episode. This might be foundational post-growth readings or just something recent that has colored your thought on these issues.
Say, don't listen to me. I would caution people, don't listen to me. I'll answer your question. But I wanted to go find these things for myself. And people recommended books to me and I read them, and recommended articles to me and I read them. But go find people. I think myself, and I think people learn best when it's a passion that they want to learn about, and they'll go find anything anywhere and just dive down that rabbit hole. So go find for yourself, first of all. But I will give a couple. People in the degrowth world, this comes up again and again, so I'm not original. But Jason Hickel's book, Less is More, is one of the best. Kate Raworth's work in Donut Economics is a great one. The original Limits to Growth is, of course, a good one. A guy I met earlier this year, for those visually inclined, did a documentary for the BBC on degrowth. His name's Alvaro Alvarez. It's just BBC documentary for degrowth. Could Degrowth Save the World, I think is the title of it. And just look for resources out there. I'm on LinkedIn. I have a Substack on degrowth. Feel free to bother me if you want. And feel free to bother other people you find in the degrowth movement. Most of them will want to talk to you because we realize we need to grow this movement. We need to grow this tent. But I would say just be curious and follow your curiosity where it leads you on these topics. And the Mammoth textbook from Herman Daly as well. That's what I should say. It's not Mammoth. It's very readable. A couple hundred pages, but that's a great introduction as well.
All great reads. On my side, I'll share with you that I've been fascinated not by Less is More, but by More and More and More, which is a book that recently came out by the French historian of science and technology, Jean-Baptiste Fressoz. And it does a great job reframing how one thinks about energy transitions in history, showing how each new energy source has simply added to rather than replace the old one. So great.
It's just adding on to what's already there. It's not replacing it. Yeah,
exactly. So very topical reading. Listen, as we come to the end of our conversation, I really want to thank you, Matt, for sharing a thoughtful and honest perspective on your journey confronting the limits to growth. What strikes me the most from our conversation is that degrowth, and the people remember that degrowth is not about deprivation or voluntary recession. It's about recognizing what actually creates human flourishing, whether that's connecting with each other or reconnecting with our natural world. I think your journey is also a testament to the idea that the kind of change that's required starts with a great reimagining from people who understand how our current system works, why it needs to transform, and also who actively shapes the democratic conversation to determine what that change looks like. And in that sense, I really appreciated the clear illustrations of degrowth policies that you mentioned.
What you were just saying right there made me think of another way to frame it. This may be something people don't want to hear, but when you stop and think about it, it explains it very well. Is that degrowth isn't austerity. Austerity is you want something and someone takes it away and you hope it comes back because you can't do without it. Degrowth is you realize you don't need that thing and you don't want that thing because it's ultimately doesn't bring you happiness, doesn't bring you prosperity that we're talking about, and is bad for your community and your children in the long run. And so it's a giving up of something that isn't and wasn't needed. There's nice things to have. There are nice inventions, but it's not deprivation. It's not austerity. And that often gets lost. I just wanted to talk about that.
Of course, in this context, the disaster or design framing feels particularly apt. We can either wait for planetary boundaries to force change upon us,
right.
And some countries and geopolitical regions will experience that due to their own situation, or we can thoughtfully design a transition to an economy that respects both human well-being and ecological limits. For listeners interested in learning more, Matt, is there any place that you'd like to recommend they they seek out your work? I know you mentioned your LinkedIn and Arketa.
I mentioned I have a Substack on what's called Degrowth is the Answer on Substack. And I started a couple years ago just to push this conversation forward. And now there's many more people who are running on that. There's a great resource, the Degrowth database, to look up. It's resources about what's going on in degrowth all around the world. You might be able to find people near you that are doing the same thing. But again, I encourage people just to dive into, whether it's through YouTube videos or Substack or LinkedIn or reading books or finding other people in the community, in your community, who are talking about this. Just go out. Everybody learns differently. Everybody experiences, the changes in their community and changing their communities differently. So go out and do what you do, however you can.
For sure. As for me, the work continues at MIT. So in closing, thank you for listening. I'm Gabriel Bonomi, and we'll be back with more conversations exploring pathways to a more just and sustainable future very soon. Thank you for listening to the Empty World podcast. If this conversation resonated with you, I'd love to hear about it. You can find me online. I hope you enjoyed this conversation and that you'll stick around for the next one we have in store for you. The very best.